Great. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from. And thank you for joining us. My name is Kaide Kawauchi. I'm the program manager at the Intentional Endowments Network. And I'm joining you from the Seattle area where I grew up, which is occupied land of the Duwamish, Squamish, Mapuche, and Snoqualmie tribes. And one of the reasons why we start these sessions with land acknowledgements is to remind us that repairing our relationships with place, with people, and this planet is at the center of our collective work to transform our capital allocation and investment processes. And today's webinar is about one firm's journey to address one of the key sustainability challenges, racial inequity, in their portfolio construction and why they saw the need to do so. We're excited to have Victor Howell from Natixis and Lorraine Wilson from Just Capital, as well as our board member, Anthony Russ, join us for this conversation. And our hope is that their story will be useful in helping other investors get a sense of why strategies like this make financial sense and what these racial equity investing portfolios might look like in practice. We'll have 15 minutes of Q&A after their presentation, so we look forward to hearing your input and reactions to what they have to share. And before we start, we also hope that you can join us for the June milestone of the 2021 Climate Action Pursuit. For those of you who are hearing about it for the first time, the Pursuit is a series of virtual convenings with 4 milestone events throughout the year focused on supporting higher ed institutions take action on sustainability challenges, including racial inequity. The agenda is now live, and the speaker list is continuing to be updated on the event site listed on the slide deck, so please check those out. And our last few points about today's webinar. So this webinar is being recorded, and we will share this recording with all the participants on this call today. And you are all muted, but we also welcome your comments, your feedback, your input throughout the conversation using the chat box or the Q&A menu. All right, oh, sorry, I will stop sharing now. All right, so with that, let's dive into the conversation. And Victor, let's start with you. Can you start us off by talking about Natixis' journey in developing this portfolio? What was the impetus? And how did you think about the financial case of integrating DI considerations into the investment process?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, thank you, everyone for having us and being here for this discussion. I think it's an interesting discussion to hear about this, this racial justice portfolio. And when I think about the journey, I think it's best to start with our corporate culture, the racial reckoning of 2020 and our response to that. At Natixis, it's always been a focus on CSR, ESG, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. But 2020 was really that catalyst for taking inventory of what we were doing around the organization. And we've advocated for ESG for quite some time throughout the industry on a global level. Recently, we're the founding members of the AIF Institute Center for ESG and Sustainable Investing. And we also require our employees to attend the PRI Academy course and attain a certificate that certifies their understanding of the principles for responsible investing. And our affiliates, they have ESG, SRI, thematic impact, and sustainability offerings. And for those of you who take a step back, for those of you unfamiliar with our model, we operate a global centralized distribution platform for over 24 boutique investment managers that have independent operations, and essentially there's a diversity of thought that comes from that. But kind of back to what I was saying there, we've continued to innovate in this space, and most recently we had the Natixis Sustainable Futures Target Date Series, which is the first of its kind. And really, when I think about the events of 2020, unknowingly at the time, it really jump-started our journey. A lot of light was shed on the racial disparities in the U.S. around, COVID-19 health disparities and the K-shaped recovery, when the market started to come back. And a lot of people of color experienced that. And at the same time, the George Floyd murder was a catalyst for action across the board here. I was on the Global Diversity Steering Committee, but I also started back in 2017, the Multicultural and Diversity Engagement Group at Natixis, which is an employee resource group. So we had channels in place, when all of this, racial tension and social unrest was kind of going on. We had channels in place to have these discussions internally, and we had the ear of leadership, which I thought was very important. And we had unprecedented levels of dialogues around social and racial justice. And from that dialogue came our corporate response. We quickly identified our focus areas. We began promoting racial and social justice and DE&I more broadly. And we intentionally prioritized, racial, social equity, and the various commitments alongside of that. So, we revamped our philanthropy, our partnerships, our educational engagements internally, and who we were bringing in to speak to our people. We launched courageous conversations with moderators, discussed and we communicated demographic aspirations for our organization. And we even launched a scholarships and internship program. And alongside of that, to incentivize the values we want our employees to represent, we started a President's Club level award called the Together for Better Award to kind of recognize those individuals who are achieving those values. So there was really a top-down tone set around ESG and diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a no-brainer, understanding that's built into our culture here. But Kurt Overway, he's the president and portfolio manager of Active Index Advisors and Managed Portfolio Advisors, and he was involved in those discussions. And he really wanted to do more. And the infamous 2020 really made us reflect on how we can be an active part of the solution at the end of the day. And to arrive at this solution, we spent a lot of time reviewing the available measurable data and then leveraging a diverse team to ensure we can really consider all the various perspectives on these issues. I would say Kurt was sparked by some interest from an RIA who was familiar with our direct indexing strategies and our customized solutions. And Kurt started researching. He wanted to see what other firms were doing. And what we saw was there were, exclusionary strategies that were being run. They were excluding firearms, predatory lending, lack of board diversity, and various controversies. And we, that's great. But at the same time, it didn't seem differentiated. It didn't seem compelling. It didn't seem complete. And, active management's a big thing at Natixis. So when we think about that, we wanted to do a little bit more, and we really wanted to not just have a index that excluded a couple of companies. We wanted to, reward some of the companies for some of the things that they were doing right. Kurt built out this diverse cross-departmental working group, and he sourced people from the multicultural and diversity group that I had mentioned earlier to kind of be on that board. He wanted to get this diverse perspective, and they spent a lot of time really outlining key racial inequalities and social justice issues. One of the challenges they saw were the incomplete data sources. We were using MSCI for a lot of our other factor tilts, but what we saw is that things like healthcare access or food deserts, those were hard and really difficult to measure. Those criteria were really tough to measure, and we really wanted this data to inform the positive screenings to maximize the impact that we could have. We wanted companies that were establishing diversity targets, pay equity policies, diversity, equity, and inclusion disclosures. We also wanted, well, when I think about today, this data and these screenings, it's a really low bar. It really is centered on just having policies in place. So, we wanted to reflect, a little more of that. We wanted to, like I said, award some of the leaders in this space. We wanted some robust data screening, and we really wanted to take our time and have a dedicated way to, measure the progress some of these firms were taking. So while going through this process, Anthony and Demetrius were working with Natixis in a consulting capacity around DE&I, as part of our commitment to really reflecting on what we're doing. And Kurt had a great conversation with Anthony around kind of, Anthony's background in on the investment side, but as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. And from there, Anthony began bringing resources to the table and research to the table for us to kind of work on our process. And later, Kurt asked Anthony to join the advisory board. It was a working group initially, became the advisory board. And Tony was a key resource for the launch. He brought the McKinsey diversity study to the table, which was an extremely compelling study. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight from that study was the stat that they had in there around, when you consider the profitability, they said that, the greater diversity in executive teams, at corporations were 36% more likely to outperform, while the bottom quartile was 29% more likely to underperform. And they said that relationship was steepening over time, which means that there is a penalty for opting out of this, and there is, a reward for being that good corporation and having the diversity, equity, inclusion policies in place. So from there, Anthony also brought in Just Capital. That was a critical step for us because that allowed us to get that diversity, equity, and inclusion data set we were looking for. And that really enhanced our ability to do some of these positive screenings. So to sum that whole thing out, really, the racial reckoning of 2020, the unprecedented levels of dialogue we had at this organization from the top, our culture already at Natixis around ESG, and some investor interest with some key drivers for this product. But our investment capabilities and the extensive work by Anthony, Kurt, Lorraine, and Just Capital, and the advisory board really made the launch of this racial equity portfolio possible. So, we're really excited about this strategy.
Thank you, Victor. Anthony, do you want to just build on what Victor just shared and how you got involved in this partnership and your role in developing this portfolio?
Sure. Victor did a great job in summing up, how we came to meet with Natixis. And so it really, just to give you a little, take one step back, sort of in the aftermath of the racial justice issues of last summer, many organizations and institutions, like we all know, had to reflect and do an introspection on matters of race, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as a Black man and an investment professional with 30 years in this industry, I really wanted to see our industry, investment professionals, institutional investors, investment banks, and asset managers really take some meaningful action to positively impact racial equity within our industry. And Natixis was already out front in terms of its commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, but they wanted to go deeper, as Victor said. So through my relationship with Venn Diagram as a consultant, my partner Demetrius Russell and I entered into this comprehensive DEI engagement with Natixis to assist the firm on their next phase of their DEI journey. That includes things like HR, right, where we help them set demographic goals for increasing diversity amongst its personnel over time, DEI leadership training and education, and ERG consultation and more. But here's the difference, right? And while we know many investment firms, around the country brought in DEI experts or DEI consultants to do some of the things we mentioned, Natixis deserves so much more credit because they were really willing to take a look at their investment management model and not only incorporate racial equity criteria into their investment management processes, but they were willing to create a standalone product specifically targeted at racial justice, as Victor talked about. So our engagement really offered, in addition to the core DEI consulting services, we offered to help them provide consultation on the construction of the strategy and the product. And the first thing we did was bring in Just Capital. And I recommended that Natixis engage with Just Capital because I had known about their great work in the leadership space on the issues of racial justice and thought it would be a great fit. And then on top of that, we additionally helped Natixis really identify and refine those qualitative investment criteria to go more in depth on the research. And we even further did some more fundamental research on some of the securities in the portfolio. And so I know Victor's really going to talk more about the design of the portfolio and the process. So I'm going to hold off on that and for now, and we'll get into more of the details soon.
Thank you, Anthony. So Lorraine, Anthony brought you into this whole process. What is Just Capital? What do you do? And why did you decide to partner with Natixis on this?
Sure. Thanks, Kaide. Just Capital is a 501c3 nonprofit research organization. Our biggest differentiator is really that we're consulting with the public to identify the issues of importance. So we're out there polling throughout the year, producing an annual ranking of large public companies and where they stand on these issues. And it's not my views as Lorraine Wilson, it's really the public across the US, across different demographic groups. We're co-founded by a group of concerned Americans, including Paul Jones, Arianna Huffington, Deepak Chopra, that came together just recognizing there's a lot of inequality, but that we needed to really figure out what was important to the public and channel corporations to really address those issues. So we do a lot of engagement. We're pulling publicly available data. And just to highlight some of what our polling has told us, the public's really concerned about companies and whether or not workers are making a fair and livable wage. So thinking about inequality, certainly wages factors into that. They're also concerned about and have highlighted for us the importance of a corporation's ability to create a diverse workforce, to also have an inclusive workforce and to protect workers' health and safety. Historically, Just Capital, because of the way we're focused in terms of being led by the public and reflecting their concerns, we focused a lot on social issues, so the S in ESG. And that is, it's not us tipping the scales, it's really just these kitchen table issues that are on the minds of so many Americans across the country, across party lines and levels of education and income. I'd also mention they look at things like benefits and work-life balance. And so when Victor was walking through his own firm and their policies, I mean, it's exactly in line with what we would recommend doing. And we've published a lot of research on the blueprint for racial equity. So tools that C-suite leaders at publicly traded companies and others can use to think about advancing equity within their company, their community, and society. And so there's so many different levers, many of which Victor's walked through that his own firm has done. There's so many different levers that firms have in terms of being able to advance equity.
Great. Is that blueprint available on your website?
It is, and we're happy to email it out to participants. So we worked on it with firms like PolicyLink and FSG, our partners in this work. And we've made that available to the public. And then we actually revisited the participants from our blueprint work and asked how it was going. And that was just released on our website the other day. So sort of insights, what is it like to be a C-suite leader, actually trying to implement these policies, trying to disclose more information on the demographic breakdown of your workplace, for example, advance equity on your boards. So we've got both the lessons learned and the best practices on our site, and we can share those broadly.
That would be great. So let's get into the approach, the details of the approach. Victor, how did Natixis design this portfolio, and what was the process? Can you just give us a taste of what went through Natixis' mind when you were going through this this process, and can you talk about the data and the metrics that you used for the strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. I mean, it really starts with really what information and what values, what social justice issues we really want to reflect in this portfolio. So as I mentioned, there was a working group which became an advisory board that was put together, and they did intensive work really to meet and outline the key racial and social issues. I mean, there was a lot of fuel in 2020 around everything going on. People were passionate about this. They spent a lot of time reviewing these things. There were a lot of discussions. There were a lot of debates on various issues. One of the issues, to give you an example, was on aerospace and defense. So we had folks on the committee who didn't want defense contractors in there, and there were folks who wanted to say, well, you can't take out that whole entire sector. So there was a good debate around that, because some folks didn't want the arms, in the portfolio, the firearms and whatnot. So, we had those debates, but ultimately there are other firms in that sector, in the aerospace sector, like, firms that are making airplanes and other things. Like, those firms aren't the ones that you want to exclude. So we looked at other data for that. But I think the challenge overall was really we were lacking kind of complete data. There wasn't a lot of data available on this, but we needed to figure out what was measurable, what's being disclosed by all these companies, and also at what frequency that stuff was being disclosed, so that we could have some type of apples to apples comparison. So there was a lot of research done. We had to pull a lot of different sources for research. Lorraine and Anthony, they were huge in this, because Anthony was able to bring us in, put on our radar a lot of advocacy groups, nonprofits that we should be looking at, and federal resources where, for example, there's a federal website that's highlighting, banks involved in predatory lending and kind of giving them rankings. So we could use that type of data. We also had research from our affiliate Morova, who's a global thought leader, in this space. They engage with regulators, they engage a lot on these topics. So we had that as well. And, Anthony also brought in the McKinsey study, which was huge. That helped with the framework. McKinsey put out a study. I think they put out 3 already on diversity. The most recent was in 2020. And they really hit on, a framework and kind of some of the key issues and statistics around it to really substantiate a conversation on this. But then also we had MSCI, and MSCI, wasn't entirely complete. There was lacking a lot of DE&I data. I mean, they did have things like, women on boards, but as it gets into the racial aspects of this, that wasn't really available. So we used a lot of the MSCI data primarily for negative screening, and, Just Capital came in, it came in strong with their information to help us with our positive screenings. I mean, when I think about this process, we're really looking to align kind of the values and the concerns on racial and social justice with the portfolio, right? So specifically, this AIA S&P 500 racial justice portfolio is going to invest in companies that are helping to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion by taking these proactive actions. They're going to be establishing policies and targets. They're going to be instituting pay equity policies. They're disclosing and they're promoting diversity on their boards, amongst their management, and across the workforce. They're also actively supporting businesses owned by people of color, and they're working to improve, health equity by promoting equitable access to, the various products there. What they're looking at, avoiding or divesting from are the companies that are causing or are contributing, exploiting, or profiting from racial injustice, through the various activities like predatory lending, discriminatory lending, redlining, or significant involvement in for-profit prisons, for-profit bail, prison labor, or involved in surveillance efforts of immigrants and the detention of immigrants. They're also excluding or looking to avoid, companies that are manufacturing or selling firearms or ammunition, companies that have significant involvement in the defense industry. And as I mentioned, that was one that we had to, come to terms on and find the healthy medium. And then they're also removing companies that have diversity controversies or poor environmental practices or significant controversies. One thing I learned is that, a lot of these environmental issues and catastrophes end up on the shores of people of color. So it's, it's really tied into, this racial social justice issue. And then when I think about kind of how we move through this portfolio and how we get from that information to, an actual portfolio, we really start with 505 securities. So the S&P 500, we're going to screen in the investable universe. We're going to screen out the red flags and the issues that we're finding. And then we're going to end up with about 309 securities based off the S&P. We're going to apply a multi-factor optimization process. We're going to break that down to about 225 names, and that's going to get us around a predicted 1.4 tracking error to the S&P, despite this high level of customization that we're providing. So when I think about that, and when we're talking to clients who are indexing, I really have to ask them, understanding kind of that, those are the type of attributes, what's holding you back from investing in a strategy like this that's aligning with your values. So this was what makes me really excited about getting this out and talking to a lot of people about this product, because it seems like it aligns with the values and it hits the boxes that it needs to hit as far as an investment for clients. So that's just my thoughts there.
Awesome. And so it sounds like Natixis relied heavily on data gathered by groups like Just Capital. And given how central your data was on this process, Lorraine, can you talk about Just Capital's tracker, the methodology for gathering this type of data?
Sure.
And some of the key metrics you're using for assessing corporations on their racial equity practices?
Sure. Our focus is really multi-pronged, right? I mean, the data is, some of it is there, but we're working on getting more information out there into the public domain. So we think about it in terms of transparency. Part of what we do that really helps us as a startup get the attention of the C-suite at hundreds of Russell 1000 companies, which is our universe, is we're transparent in that we'll share the raw data that we've collected, or a proprietary calculation will reflect that back to the companies. And so they know exactly where they stand in our system, our way of tracking versus peers. So that's, for starters, is the transparency is key. What are you measuring? What have you gathered? What is your source? We're sharing all of that. So very important, especially when working with a partner like Natixis. It's not a black box, just trust us. We've got the information. It's more, here's the source, here's the date of the source, and here's why it's meaningful. So I'd say transparency is key. Engagement. So one of the initiatives we really focused on at the end of last year and coming into this year was EEO-1 disclosure. So that equal opportunity information companies are collecting on their workforce, they're sharing it with the government, and we just want it made public. It's just a great way to see how companies are doing by their workers. Are you paying them fairly across gender, across ethnicity, race? What are the job bands to different categories of workers? How far away are they from the CEO? There's a lot of information that we can pull from that kind of reporting. And a lot of companies are not making it public. By our count, mid last year, there are about 59 out of the Russell 1000 that had made it public. And there was actually a correlation between that level of disclosure and outperformance versus companies that had not made that information public. So when we think about companies like Intel really setting the gold standard in terms of disclosure on workforce demographic and pay, Just such an interesting thing to hold up, a good example. And then when I mention engagement, we're highlighting companies like Intel through our Just quarterly call and having their C-suite go out and say, this is what we did, it puts us in the spotlight, but here's why we thought it was important. And so we'll do these showcases where we'll show leaders that have really stepped up to the plate. And we'll also do things like work with public plans. So we had a great initiative where we worked with New York City Comptroller Scott Stringer. He sent a letter to the S&P 100 and said, hey, we want this data, make it public. So those are some ways in which we can engage and really move forward disclosure, which is beneficial for everyone. A lot of investors are starting to look at EEO-1 information. So that's just one example out of many. And then there's accountability. So you mentioned the tracker. We'll share the link with the participants. It's a service on our site. We looked at the top 100 employers, largest companies, and we said, let's look at the policies that they have in place. So there were 6 different things that we looked at, looking at things like, what is their pay equity policy? What about racial and ethnic diversity data? So I mentioned EEO-1 information. What education and training programs are in place? What's their response to mass incarceration? An important one that's getting more airtime these days. Community investments. Are they making any investments in their local community? We also look at things like apprenticeship programs. That's a community issue. So are you bringing veterans into the fold, for example, through apprenticeship programs? And then anti-discrimination policies and other things like a grievance mechanism. Those are some of the areas that we're tracking. So the tracker's that accountability. And then in terms of the data that we're gathering year over year, we're looking at things like the existence of a diversity and opportunity policy, targets, harassment policy, not just, that's pretty broad across a number of different items. Grievance mechanism I mentioned. So those are some of the things. And then, you've got these policies, but if the results if the outcomes aren't great, then we want to see from the C-suite, well, what are you doing? So let's say you're looking at pay equity and it's not a good story. What are you then doing to account for that, to do better? So that's just an example of how we approach it, which is very holistic. It's the gathering the data from CSR reports, company websites, announcements, all over, you name it, government sites, and pulling it all together to paint a picture and be transparent in terms of how a company stacks up, but then trying to get more data out there. And sometimes it means shining a light on a topic that's new and just keeping at it until you get more disclosure.
Hey, Kaide, if I could elaborate too on what both Victor and Lorraine said, about the data sources, right, and how they support our screens that we're using. So just as Lorraine really talked about, disclosure is a big driving force for a lot of this information, right? And so, EEO-1 data, as she talked about, is critical. But, when you only have 59 companies, willing to disclose that EEO-1 data, we know that we need to do something to drive incentive for these companies more companies to disclose. And so what's really tied to this is also shareholder engagement strategies, right? And Lorraine talked about the New York City Comptroller's Office as a big shareholder of a lot of companies. And so what we're also looking at then is, did management support at their annual meeting, right, resolutions to disclose pay equity, resolutions to disclose their EEO-1 data, right? And how they voted on that. And that'll be a key factor and criteria whether they'll make it into this portfolio, right? And as Lorraine, really put it nicely, disclosing your EEO-1 data in and of itself is not, and it's bad numbers, it's not a disqualifier, right? But we need to say, okay, you've disclosed your EEO-1 data, it's not looking good, okay? What are your plans? As Lorraine said, what are your plans to increase diversity amongst your employees? What are your plans to, true up pay equity among your employees? And so those things are tied together. That shareholder engagement is critical long-term and near-term to getting more companies to disclose their EEO-1 data. The other thing I'll also talk about is another screen we have is are these companies doing business with Black and brown companies in terms of service providers, right? Most of these corporations and public companies spend billions of dollars on products, goods, and services that they outsource, right, to service providers, right? What percentage of your corporate diversity spend is going to diverse companies, right? And so that's another thing we're really pushing for, right? And so we're working with organizations like the National Minority Supplier Diversity Council, right? Just Capital tracks this information to see who actually has a diversity corporate spending supplier program. And then if they're willing to tell us they do, what does that look like? And what percentage of their corporate spend is spent on diverse managers? And then, you know, on the negative screening side, just to give folks a little more granular data on how do we identify a company, say, as a predatory lender, we'll use data resources like US PIRG, right? If you're on the US PIRG's predatory lending list, you know, that's a key factor for us. Or we'll look at CRA ratings on discriminatory lending practices, right? If you're a bank or a lender, right, and your last CRA exam, you've got a significant non-compliance or needs improvement, that's a factor, that's an issue for us, right? And then when we talk about sort of significant diversity controversies like MSCI flags and rep risk flags, right? What's the level of that diversity controversy, right? What is, you know, is it a moderate diversity controversy or is it a severe diversity controversy? So just trying to give a little bit more granular information on the sources we use to support the screens, both on the proactive side as well as the negative screening side.
And Victor, like, as you get more information on these companies, how does your kind of process change and assessment process change for your portfolio?
Yeah, so, you know, we have that advisory committee that I mentioned. So this advisory committee, this advisory board, you know, they're doing a lot of qualitative, you know, review work. You know, they're meeting on a quarterly basis to kind of discuss, you know, all the factors that we initially considered. So they're going to review all the factors that we initially have considered here as racial and social justice issues. They're also going to discuss any new developments around those issues. But then any new issues, any new racial or social justice issues that they think need to be reflected in the portfolio as new information comes in. They're going to be looking at, you know, what changes need to be made based off of that. And right now, there haven't been any significant changes. I mean, you know, we kind of, you know, launched it this year. So there haven't been any significant changes, but we did notice some controversy scores that did move from some of our MSCI screenings. And you know, from there, there's a qualitative assessment that takes place amongst the team to really determine, you know, the nature of these shifts. You know, is this a racial issue? Is this a social justice issue? And then from there is, you know, is it really appropriate or not to remove that name or that company from the portfolio based on that issue? So, you know, again, we kind of go through that as a committee and have those conversations, kind of debate it. And then from there, you have our, you know, our quarterly rebalance. And the quarterly rebalance is really just a, you know, the refresh of any companies that might have fallen in or out. And we look at our multi-factor risk model and we, you know, we kind of put it back through our multi-factor risk model and optimizer, and we measure, you know, that predicted tracking error that I mentioned, and we try to manage within that. So, you know, that's pretty much, you know, the process from a, you know, a qualitative perspective here.
And Lorraine, you mentioned that Intel is kind of like a gold standard for some of these things. Do you have any other corporations that you can give as an example that particularly stood out to you, or companies who are doing poorly on some of these metrics?
Sure. We try not to name and shame, but one thing I did want to highlight, just responding to Victor, it's so important to keep revisiting your approach, and that's how the polling really helps us. I wanted to share two stats. One of which is that 70% of Americans believe that corporate leaders should be addressing social issues. So, you know, if it seems as if, you know, maybe firms are getting carried away on this journey, we're hearing from our polling that the public wants this. So they think that the social issues that should be looked at are things like social inequality, but also protecting our democratic process. So these are the insights we're hearing from around the country that I wanted to highlight. And then another poll that we do some oversampling And we work with Harris Polling, and we also work with NORC out of the University of Chicago. And I wanted to share that according to that research, 80% of Black Americans, and in some cases, depending on the question, close to 90%, said it's very important for companies to pay a living wage, commit to diverse hiring and apprenticeships, and create a diverse supplier pipeline. So kind of tying it all together with what Anthony was mentioning, diverse suppliers, what are your policies there, but also just the fact that we are revisiting these topics, and we can see that it really is top of mind how companies address these systemic issues at large.
Great. Anything to add there, Victor or Anthony?
Yeah, I think she hit it on the head. I think, you know, it's just interesting to see as you kind of go through the data, kind of the different aspects that affect, you know, people of color and kind of the ability to capture. And we think that as, you know, this becomes more mainstream as far as kind of the reporting and everything, as we go to make changes on this portfolio, you know, we think that, you know, we'll be able to incorporate different aspects. But, you know, as time goes on and people start to adopt these reporting and these disclosures, I think that that's going to be key for us to having, you know, more and more information. But we feel we have a pretty substantial amount of information to kind of build this portfolio. So it's something that, you know, Natixis is totally behind, and we're really excited about to get out there.
Awesome. Well, great. Thank you. I want to open it up for questions now. I'll be pulling questions from the chat box, so please feel free to start plugging them in there. And we also received a few questions through the forms that you all submitted when you registered for this webinar. So, and we got a lot. So if we don't get to your questions today, please follow up with us, because we want to make sure that you're walking away from this webinar with an action item or a resource or a contact that you can follow up with. And the first question is for you, Anthony. This is on peer examples. So the other hat that you wear is a trustee at the Warren Wilson College. And so curious to hear your thoughts on, do you know of any endowments or other types of institutional investors who are setting targets for their portfolios on racial equity metrics? And more specifically, where is Warren Wilson College on this?
So I'll speak to Warren Wilson College first, and then address the second or the first part of your question. So Warren Wilson College is in Asheville, North Carolina. It's a small liberal arts college. I chair the endowment fund, the investment committee that oversees the endowment fund. And I could tell you what we're doing in terms of advancing racial equity within our portfolio. So in October, we, at our investment committee meeting, we sent a survey to all of our managers that manage money for us. And we asked them, you know, have they or do they incorporate racial equity and gender equity criteria in their investment management processes when they're evaluating a stock or a bond? And we got back, we have 14 managers that manage money, and most of them came back and said they do not, which was not surprising, right? And then we sent a follow-up survey questioning whether they have a willingness or do they plan to incorporate racial equity criteria or gender equity criteria in their investment processes. And what we suspect is that some of them will come back and say they will, because they have an ESG framework as part of their overall investment management mandate with us. And as Lorraine said earlier, the S is clearly where racial equity and gender equity falls in the ESG framework. And we suspect they'll come back and have a nice conversation about that. We want to have a conversation with our managers. We want to have a conversation with those managers who want to manage our money, right? And we want to let them know that we believe this is not only the right thing to do, to have this type of metrics or screening in your portfolio, in your investment management framework, but it's the right thing to do financially. Right. And as Victor said earlier, reports like Deloitte, McKinsey, Forbes, and others have shown that companies that embrace diversity, companies that are more inclusive, perform better financially relative to their peers. and they tend to be more productive and profitable. And so we believe that if our investment managers are not incorporating racial equity and gender equity criteria into their investment management processes, that they are limiting the opportunities for more thorough diligence, potential upside, and potential downside risk to the companies that they're investing in.
Thanks, Anthony. And Victor, this question is for you on impact measurement. But the question is, how are you going to measure success and progress against racial equity and report on the impact of this portfolio?
Yeah, so I mean, as it stands right now, the advisory committee is kind of discussing some of these things. As I mentioned, it's pretty new. So we're discussing kind of how we're going to kind of take these steps to measure this, how we're going to, whether or not it's something we'll be publishing, and kind of, how much data that we'll really get from this. So that's not set in stone as to how we're going to measure and kind of what we're going to report on as far as the impact is concerned. I will ask Anthony, because I know Anthony's a key member on that committee. He probably can add something to that.
So the question, Kaide, was
around impact measurement. How are you tracking progress, and how are you reporting the impact of this portfolio?
Yeah, great question. So we're setting a baseline, right? This is a very new portfolio. We're going to set a baseline, for each company from a qualitative standpoint, and measure their progress, over time periods, right? It may not be on a quarterly basis because we need to give companies time, but probably on an annual basis, we're going to be measuring whether companies have actually, who've made, say, for example, public disclosure statements about, we're going to reach X amount of diversity in our personnel by such and such a time. Have you made incremental steps towards that progress, right? Or was your statements more performative in nature, which we know, we suspect based on past history, right, that a lot of companies are not serious about necessarily their DEI initiatives, but we're going to hold them accountable. And I would also say, as just to talk about sort of what I suspect about this portfolio, is I think the strategy will have positive relative performance on a risk-adjusted basis. I suspect that companies who are more diverse will continue to perform better than their peers. I suspect that companies who are not as diverse and inclusive and will become more diverse and inclusive, or investor dollars, will increasingly reward those companies that do and penalize those companies that don't. And it's going to be based on financial performance, right? So I suspect we'll see more products like this, more strategies like this. I suspect that Just Capital and Natixis will continue to be thought leaders and active practitioners. But I think you'll see a flow, just like you're seeing a flow of dollars flowing into ESG. It continues to increase, right? The number of ESG investors, right? You're going to see a flow of dollars flowing into products like this, or firms that publicly acknowledge, right, that they have included racial equity and gender equity criteria in their investment management processes.
Thank you, Anthony. And this question is for Lorraine, but I would love to hear Anthony and Victor kind of add or build on what Lorraine has to share. But this question is asking about metrics and what's on the radar for you. So in what ways are you looking ahead to issues on the horizon and portfolio implications? Like, for example, the transition to a more quote unquote community-based corrections facilitated by technology, such as monitoring surveillance versus prison-based incarceration, and what should be on the horizon as investment risks and opportunities that is not being discussed widely.
Sure. I'd say we think about it a little differently. So that resonates with me. I sit on the investor side of our organization, which is a nonprofit. So I'm on the side leading our external engagements and partnerships with asset managers such as Natixis. On the research and program side, I'd say we're all aligned. We're all thinking about living wage in particular. We've been kind of making the rounds. We've had Dan Schulman from PayPal on CNBC Squawk Box to talk about doing a living wage assessment of their workforce. We know that there's increased anxiety and turnover in workforces that are not making a living wage. So I'd say living wage is one of our primary issue areas that we're really highlighting, and we do think that it is tied to equity. So one of the things that we've asked companies to do through the blueprint I mentioned and in other ways is conduct a living wage audit to determine whether or not your workers are able to make ends meet, so that they're not accessing emergency lending at the end of the month. We've actually found that millions of employees at publicly traded companies are not making ends meet every month. And you really have to look at the county level data. What are the expenses for that particular location? You as an employer might be paying above market wages, but it just might not cut it after workers pay for their healthcare premiums, for example, or whatever market rate rent is or mortgage in that area. So that's definitely an area of focus for us is living wage. And I'd say we're also talking about things like wealth building benefits, access to 401k plans, things like that can help, share the wealth for these hardworking employees, access to bank accounts, and other ways that workers can, for example, avoid using things like predatory check cashing services. So those are some of the areas that we're spotlighting. We are focused on racial inequality and things that companies can do there. And so that work that we're doing with Policy Link and FSG to really shine a light, have things like a tracker, which is separate from what we're doing on the data collection side. This is really the accountability, introducing the topic and the means to do better to the C-suite at public companies.
Yeah.
Patty, if I could jump in
please.
On that question, because I think it's a great question, specifically around the prison industrial complex and for-profit prisons. So we do have a screen, right, that limits the amount of for-profit prison securities that can be in the portfolio. And this is a debate or a discussion, I should say, amongst the advisory committee, right? Are we excluding just companies that have a direct correlation to the prison industrial complex, or are we also screening out indirect companies that make money indirectly, right? It's not right. And then we talk about sort of, just to give you guys a little bit of detail on how the sausage is made, right? Then we talk about, okay, if we're not going to include companies that make money indirectly from the prison industry, what portion of their business, is substantially derived from, indirect services to the prison industrial complex, as we continue to see this techno angle or techno business supporting that. So, we've talked about thresholds of, hey, if a business generates more than 10% of its income from this industry, that's the exclusionary metric. But so we're going back and forth on that internally, but that's how we're thinking about this. If it is indirect exposure to the corrections industry, what percentage of their business is it, and how impactful is that, right? And then we're also tying, looking at engagement strategies that are moving at trying to get companies like that to minimize their business model in terms of the for-profit corrections industry. So
I also just wanted to highlight another area which is newer, which is the second chance policy. So this is on the corporate side. Who are you recruiting to work at your company, and whether or not you're willing to hire previously incarcerated workers into your workforce. And we've seen some really great announcements from companies that have rolled out policies that are opening up the workforce. And that's encouraging to see as well.
Victor, anything to add there in terms of issues on the horizon that may have portfolio implications?
In Natixis, we stay tapped into kind of the environmental concerns and kind of, really invested there, just for one, because, at our firm, part of our culture, as I mentioned, is kind of ESG, and we have affiliates that have been doing a lot on the environmental side on a global scale. So, we're really staying tapped into that. And I think we're monitoring things, like, the sustainability of the ocean and things like that, because we have, a lot of research coming out of our affiliate Morova, and, they have strategies around things like that, as well as, some of the major themes, that we're seeing play out, like urbanization and things like that going on throughout the world. So we're monitoring things like that and really trying to align kind of what we're doing at our firm and what we're doing from a policy perspective. And internally, we're trying to align that with what we're seeing take place in the world, but also stay kind of locked in with those investment themes. And we're doing that not just with this strategy, but with a lot of other strategies. So there's no particular area that we're really honed in on, but I know from a corporate level, the environmental aspect is a major aspect. And some of the studies that we've been looking at really highlight kind of the effects that these environmental concerns have on people of color and indigenous people. The toxic waste, the landfills, a lot of that stuff really affects these communities. So that's something that, I mean, it's an indirect focus, but it's something that we're definitely as a firm kind of really behind.
Absolutely. And on the theme of metrics, Keith Beverly, hi Keith, he asks, does the methodology consider inputs from BIPOC employees at the constituent companies? And then, is Natixis diverse owned?
It might be a Just Capital question. I'm happy to answer from our perspective. When we do our survey research, just to level set, we are not mentioning companies by name. So when we go out and poll on the issues that are important, and we take the weights from that survey to then rank companies, it is a hypothetical large corporation that we're polling on, so as not to tip the scale. So that's just in terms of framing the conversation and how we're ranking and scoring companies. And then our universe is a Russell 1000. So when we're looking at performance, it's of those companies on those issues using publicly available data. But we do use some crowdsourced information when we're looking at things like benefits, for example. So in that sense, as part of the data gathering, you are getting feedback from the employees at the company. I can't say that it's as detailed as we're able to tailor it to different demographic groups, but that's certainly something to aspire to in terms of getting that level of information.
And to that question, just to answer, I mean, no, we're not a diverse owned company, but we have a major diversity focus, and I know we work towards kind of, as I say, everyone can get better at these things. We're always striving to be better at these things, but at the end of the day, I know that we're taking our actions and really putting it behind these values. So internally, we're focused on driving that diversity and creating those opportunities. I mean, I think you see kind of that aspect of our culture really manifests itself in how this, for example, this advisory board came together, because Kurt went out there understanding that he doesn't have the perspectives on some of these issues, and he really pulled in a lot of other people, people of color, to have these conversations and to have that perspective, and to give that perspective and have that seat at the table. So I think that from that perspective, we're definitely focused on diversity big time at our organization, but no, it's not necessarily a diverse owned company.
If I could just add or elaborate a little bit on the question. So I think, when we're looking at companies, right, and if the question asked about whether the investment process incorporates conversations with employees of these companies, the answer is no directly, right? But when we're looking at sort of the MSCI data, and if we see that there is a controversy, a diversity controversy, then we'll still do a little bit more in-depth research as to what's going on there, right? And so we'll find out, are there lawsuits, from people of color at these businesses, right? And then, what's the level? Is it one-offs? Is it a handful of people, or is it risen to a level where it's a class action suit, which obviously, really sends red flags off to us. And so we'll have to do that, but not directly. We'll do sort of independent, research and try and find out what's the experience of BIPOC employees, at these companies, through information like lawsuits, which triggers us to look deeper. Let me also just say one other thing. So when we're looking at that, and this is going to be evolving, that screen that talks about, are these businesses, right, these corporations, public companies doing business with Black and brown service providers? We're also looking at their pension funds or their 401ks to see if they're utilizing Black or brown owned asset management firms, right? We're looking to see, they do a lot of investment banking, right? Borrowing, public companies borrow money. Are they using Black or brown investment banking firms, right? So, that's a little bit more granular, but that's the type of information as that screen evolves that we're going to be looking for.
Okay. And this may be the last question. It's actually not a question, it's a comment. And I'm going to just read it, and I would love to hear all of your responses to this comment. And this person writes, I am struggling with racial equity portfolios in public markets. What I see happen often is passive strategies tilting towards quote unquote better companies, but in the end, you end up with the same list of S&P 500 companies in your portfolio, many of which still have very problematic practices. The approach of tilting to reward better performance is just a play on relative performance. We're going to tilt towards company A because it has 3, POC, people of color, on the board, versus company B that only has 1. However, this investment approach doesn't actually move the needle in terms of tackling systemic racism. It's still the same companies perpetuating the same problematic practices that hurt communities of color. Anyone want to respond to that?
I'll jump out quickly and say, I think that organizations, I think people in general are moved by incentives. I think the incentive is the investment that, a strategy like this can provide to these companies that are doing the right things and starting to, reassess what they're doing internally and kind of the diversity and the representation at all levels of their organization. And I think that, with the data that Just Capital is able to collect, over time, I think we're going to be able to have a good view of the landscape and be able to really direct assets towards these companies that are doing the right thing. And I think that that's going to have a ripple effect of companies trying to, take part in that, in those flows coming to them, take part in that success that those companies are having, not like as a standalone, but also from the perspective of, having assets brought towards them. So I really think that, it really starts with the incentive. And I think that, I understand the perspective that's being conveyed there, but I think that we have to start somewhere, because if you look at corporate America right now, there isn't much representation as it is. So I think that this is a step in the right direction. I think over time, it's going to have a maximized effect.
I would just add, you have to have the engagement piece of it, right? So you have to be engaging with these corporations, and that's exactly, just being a mission-driven organization. That's what we do. So we're looking beyond corporate statements, and we're looking at actions as well. Statements are great. We saw a lot last summer, but when we come down and we look at the transparency, the disclosure, the actions, existence of policies, and compare companies versus their peers, and more broadly, the other industries in the Russell, I think that's when we can really hold them accountable and really move the needle. And on top of engagement, that showcasing leaders, where you're showing a profile of what looks good, and really encouraging other companies to step up and do the same.
So I've been in the investment industry for 30 years, right? And I'll say this, and I get the cynicism, and it's valid, right? But I would say this, that if we were ever at an inflection point, right, on issues of racial equity within the corporate investment industry, this is the time, right? And so incentives, as Victor said, can either be positive incentives or they can be negative incentives, right? And investor dollars, right, supporting companies is incentive, right? And large institutional investors who have the power to move the needle, like the New York City Comptroller's Office, like CalPERS, like other big institutions, and like Little Warren Wilson College, right? We can change corporate behavior with our investment dollars, tied to what Lorraine said, which is the engagement strategy, right? As a shareholder, right? you know, there are organizations like Just, like As You Sow, right, that are taking up issues in terms of corporate resolutions on racial equity. We've never seen so many resolutions on racial equity as we've seen this year, right? And so, you know, if ESG, if the flows of dollars flowing into ESG, you know, wasn't a factor here, I would say, yeah, this is probably, we're not going to move the needle. But you know what, I would say to the person who wrote the question, it's a great question. Let's check in a year, 2 years, 3 years, and see what happens.
Thank you, everyone. And if Lorraine, Victor, and Anthony, if you can drop in your email address in the chat box, if anyone has other questions that they want to follow up with you on. But thank you again for sharing this space and your work with us today. And thank you to all the participants for your engagement. Please stay tuned for more webinars on racial equity in 2021 and reach out to us if you are looking to learn more about this work. We're at time, so we're closing now. But again, I want to give a big thanks to our panelists, our participants, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.